the hosts of today's masterclass, Kathy Fisher and Chris Hessler. So I'll give a little bit of background on them. Kathy Fisher is a world-class marketer who has launched and grown businesses from tires to diamond rings. She loves creating brand positions and pivoting business models to generate profitable new user growth. And Chris Hessler is a serial entrepreneur and an expert in launching world-class businesses across a variety of industries, co-founding and selling 3 companies over $350 million. So both very impressive people. Just a few notes about today's event. The presentation is about 30 minutes or so. So we'll do 30 minutes presentation and 30 minutes Q&A afterwards. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we will go over those during Q&A after the presentation. You can put them in the chat, or you can private message me or anyone on my team, and we'll make sure that those questions get answered. And if you would rather raise your hand and unmute and ask the question, that is okay too. Just wait until after the presentation and we can have you do that. And I just do want to mention a few upcoming CONNECTpreneur events, which Fletcher will put the links in the chat for those, but we have another upcoming masterclass next week. And we also have our virtual event on May 30th, our virtual CONNECTpreneur event, and an upcoming event on June 13th that is in person. So like I said, you'll see the info in the chat for those. Fletcher will put that in. Okay. The goal of today's masterclass is to learn about what an advisory board is, the proof that it can work to scale your business dramatically faster, and why none of your competition uses this strategy. And most importantly, learn the secret to making an advisory board work for you. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to Kathy and Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Skylar.
Thank you, Skylar.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes of your time with us. Yes, so we are going to talk about a revenue acceleration tool that is statistically correlated across over 10,000 companies to improve your chance of scaling up by 7 times. And the really crazy thing about this, though, is that only 8% of companies use this tool. And so that means that over 90% of your competition is probably not doing this. And our experience in sort of studying this market suggests that about half of the people who are using it wrong. So I hope that kind of piques your interest. So buckle up, put your hands on your mouse, because there's going to be 7 polls in the next 30 minutes. And let's get started. So the first... let's get started. There we go. So first, we'd like to get to know you. So I think, so thank you, Skylar. So here's what we want to know. Do you consider yourself a visionary, an implementer, or perhaps a little bit of both?
We'll give it just a couple seconds for everyone to answer, and I'll share those results for you so you can see them on the screen.
These are very simple polls. They're yeses and nos. So, all right, both. So that is not surprising, because frequently the people who are entrepreneurs have a bit of both in them. So Chris, how did you answer this question?
So I am both, because I always came up with ideas, but then I got paid to execute them and make them happen.
Yes, I've seen that myself with you, because you'll go from here's our 5-year vision to, okay, here's the Excel spreadsheet of what has to get done, every day this week. And so you have this amazing ability to kind of go back and forth and work the whole spectrum. But what that means for most of the audience here is that you physically, mentally, socially, emotionally, you are your business. The business is a direct reflection of you. And in that role, we suspect that most of you have armchair quarterbacks. Now, an armchair quarterback we define as someone who says they're giving you advice, but really they're giving you their opinion. They're doing it without a lot of knowledge of the business. And a lot of times they're looking in the rear view mirror, as in, here's what you should have done. So,
And
and you
sometimes they're doing it even if not asked.
yes, and you maybe smile and move on. But so here's our next question. Have you ever had armchair quarterbacks? I feel like we should have like a sound effect while the poll's going on. Do, do,
No,
do, do, do.
I'll give you a preview. I would say most people are saying yes.
I'm sure. All right, so Chris, yes, okay, that
I
is
was a yes.
not surprising. Chris, so have you ever had an armchair quarterback, and can you sort of share with the group, as you know, in your experience as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so here's a great example. When I went to start my first business, I had a corporate job at Procter & Gamble. And I quit my corporate job. And my dad said, "You're doing what?" It all worked out, but he was armchair quarterbacking at the time.
Gotcha. And were there ever people who said, oh, you should have changed your marketing strategy, or you should, you know, go broad when you thought you needed to, I don't know, go narrow or anything like that? Did you have people like that as well?
Yeah, so one of my best and funnest businesses was, I'll talk about it in the context of advisory boards, but it was getting a contract with the U.S. Postal Service to commercialize and digitize their change of address form. A lot of people said this will never work, whether I asked them or not.
There you go. Like they're offering their free opinion.
There you go.
So yeah, I mean, here's the thing. You all, you know, you're in the arena. And I love this quote from Theodore Roosevelt: the credit belongs to the person who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat, and never with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. I mean, we know this, it's hard to be a startup person. And what happens now is that the landscape of that arena is always changing. So, I mean, Chris, how, you know, you talk to us about this a lot. You know, how frequently do you think a startup kind of company needs to pivot?
Well, you have to listen to what's going on in the market and what the customers are telling you.
Mhm.
And often, if you don't pivot, you die.
Yeah, well, which gives you good impetus to pivot. So,
Yep.
you know, I found these examples. Nintendo started as a playing card company, and then National Geographic went from being like this magazine that probably sat on your grandma's coffee table to this media powerhouse. And of course, Nintendo is the whole gaming system. I mean, how they started is not how they finished. So, as a business leader, you probably are right in the eye of the hurricane, and you are probably facing some tough choices at any given moment. You know, you're saying, okay, is it time for me to scale, and how fast do I need to scale? Should I sell this business so that I can begin something new? Should I take this business model and reapply it to another market? Or, you know, I should just sell it entirely and, you know, go retire, for example. I mean, you're probably, or maybe you just don't know. Maybe you're evaluating a lot of different options. So here's kind of the question that we wanted to pose. The next question: how sure are you that you have what you need to address the business needs that are going to happen in the next 24 months? And your choices are 150, 25, or I'll get back to you on that. All right. So do we have a preview?
Yes, preview is 50%. I still have quite a few
Okay.
responses coming in, but
Okay, interesting. So Chris, I am interested also in how you answered this one.
So I said 50%, and here's why. I think as an entrepreneur, if you have 50% visibility into the next 24 months, you're doing well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the poll kind of proves that out.
Yeah, yeah. So that's good. So and I think it's probably an important point of self-awareness if you are aware that you don't know everything. You know, that's probably a good sign.
Yep.
So we're going to move on now. We're going to talk about advisory boards because this is the tool that Skylar mentioned. And so question, do you know what an advisory board is? Because if you do, we won't go into it. If you don't, we'll take a little top line and explain it to you, or explain it to you the way we describe it.
Majority are showing yes, they do
Okay.
know.
So, okay, good. So an advisory board then, as you know, is not a fiduciary board. The advisory board reports to the CEO instead of the CEO reporting to them. Very close-knit group of trusted advisors. All right. Okay, do you need an advisory board? Is it like a requirement? And Chris,
This
would
one's
you
a
say
toss-up, so I'll let it
what?
play out. This one's a toss-up, so I'll let it play
Oh,
out for a minute.
interesting. Okay.
Like, yeah, do we legally need one, or do you mean like, do we perceive our company as needing one?
Do you think you need one?
Yep.
Not legally. Do you think you need one? Kind of goes back to how much insights you have about what's going to happen in the future. Oh, wow. Okay, 50-50. Very, very interesting. All right, so another question that I'm going to follow with this is, could you benefit from an advisory board? Meaning, do you think you could benefit from an advisory board? Or are you kind of like, oh my gosh, that's another bunch of armchair quarterbacks that I do not need in my business. So what do you think about that? And Chris, after we get the results of this, it would be great if you could sort of give a little bit of your history on the subject.
Okay.
Oh, woo. All right, 97%. This is a highly evolved group. Do you? But I think it's really interesting to hear your kind of origin story.
So about 30 years ago, I was building this business with the US Postal Service. And we actually did succeed. My partner got a contract with the US Postal Service. He called on them for a year. They said no 6 times. He kept showing up and ended up negotiating this contract with procurement. And the contract allowed us access to the change of address form. Now, this is like, early 90s. And so no internet. Everybody went to the post office to fill out a change of address form to get their first class mail forwarded, and then the little yellow stickies would follow you around. Remember that?
Yep.
So we got that contract. It was great. And then we discovered that form gets filled out 42 million times a year in the US. The average mover takes 2 forms. In the event they screw one up, then they have an extra one at home. They don't have to wait in line for another one. And so the Postal Service said to us, hey, this is great. And our proposition was super simple, super low tech. We were going to put the change of address form in a little booklet that had advertising related to the move and content related to the move. It was super simple. Okay, and then we're just going to replace all the forms with our movers guides that were called. And so the Postal Service said, great, can you please print us 84 million movers guides? And we, of course, were like 2 guys in an apartment. And we said, yeah, of course. smooth with that. And so then we went home and wondered how we would do this, because we never printed anything near that quantity. And I was at a cocktail party with a college friend of mine, and I met his father-in-law. And his father-in-law, great guy, Dick Holliday, he had spent a career selling Heidelberg printing presses to printers like Quad Graphics and R. Donald. So I went up to him, and just in that moment at the cocktail party, I invented the idea of an advisory board. I'm sure people have used it forever, but for me, I'd never used it. So I said, hey, Dick, I'm going to build an advisory board for this business, and I'd like you to be on it. And in fact, I'd like you to be the chairman. And so he said, okay, what's involved? And I said, well, let me get back to you. I'll tell you.
But did you even know what an advisory board was when you said that?
Not really. I just said I would like to have some smart people whose expertise I need, who I can't afford to hire, in my corner, advising us. And sure enough, it worked. You know, we got Gibby Carey, who had been a group VP at Procter & Gamble and advertising, on that board. I got a CFO on that board who really helped us with projections and things like that. But where Dick Holliday was so helpful, like we would go to meetings with R. Donnelly and we would bring him along. And we're like two guys in our early 30s. And we're negotiating for 84 million print job. Okay. Dick Holliday was there. He was the gray hair who helped us and brought so much credibility to our cause. And I ended up with like 10 people on my advisory board because we just kept finding people who could help us. And we ended up with a very successful business. We sold it to a public company. I think the advisory board had a lot to do with it.
Right. So your experience, and I know that you went on to build advisory boards multiple times, and I do want to come back to that. But your experience is not unusual. So in 2014, the Bank of Canada did a study of 300 companies with advisory boards compared to 300 companies without them. Mm-hmm. And they found that the average annual growth tripled after companies put an advisory board in place. And the annual growth was 24% higher than companies without advisory boards. So that's really interesting, but it was 10 years ago, which is kind of like, the Stone Age. So this other graph that I have up here is from a company called the Startup Genome. They are an evidence-based startup development company. They are world experts in what makes startups successful. And they did a study in 2023. They completed a 5-year study of over 10,000 startups around the world. And they identified that business success is statistically correlated with having an advisory board. So if you have no advisors, your chance of scaling up to $50 million is like way less than 2%. And it builds from there. If you have 1 to 2 advisors, it gets a little bit more. 3 to 4 advisors, it gets a little higher. And with 5 or more advisors, your chance of success is even up above 12%. So it's a massive improvement. And so here's the thing, though, and we do run into this when we talk about it. If in your, whichever statistics class you took first, you learned a couple things. You learned that correlation is not causation. So, can you say that the advisory boards caused the growth? Probably not. It's not correlated, but we know for sure that fast-growing companies have advisory boards. That is a characteristic of fast-growing companies. And we think that's because good leaders like yourself are good learners. And that is, data from the Center for Creative Leadership and the Harvard Business Review. It says that one of the 12 essential characteristics of a good leader is being able to know that they need to learn and having a high appetite for learning. So an advisory board puts you in kind of a continual learning mode. So, Chris, what, how did you replicate that success?
I did. So I did it, I did 12 times total in my career. 6 times as a venture-backed CEO. So I would build an advisory board every time I built a business based on the specific skill sets I needed. So I would pose to myself the magic wand test. And I would say, hey, if you had a magic wand, Chris, and you could have 5 people in your corner, what would they look like? What kind of experiences would they have? What would they bring to the party? Okay. Then I worked for 7 years in private equity as an operating partner and helped the PE firm sell a bunch of businesses. And I sat on 6 boards over 7 years. Each board I was on, I built an advisory board for the CEO. They loved this. In fact, what we ended up doing was the CEOs had subject matter experts on their fiduciary boards, but we found that the fiduciary board meetings were generally financial.
Mm-hmm.
And so the subject matter experts weren't that helpful. So we took subject matter experts, put them all on advisory boards, and filled them out with other advisors the CEO needed. So we ended up with 2 boards. And that worked really well.
All right. So cool.
And that just illustrates your point, Kathy, that an advisory board is so different from a fiduciary board.
Right. Right. It's really formed for the CEO. Okay. So this is slide 14, Chris, and this is probably the most important slide. So before the call, I was like, you've got to tell them this part. So
Well, this is one of the things I've learned in talking to CEOs is these are some of the objections that we receive. I don't want anybody to sign off yet because we have good stuff coming. But the first thing I hear is I don't need any more advice. Okay. The second thing I hear is it's hard to do. Like, I've got hair on fire. I'm got fires right and left. I don't have time to build an advisory board. And really what all that is saying is, if you go back to our days of learning about Stephen Covey, it's important but not urgent.
mm-hmm.
So what we've found is if a CEO can decide it's important and urgent, and then figure out how to run it properly, it'll make a difference.
Yeah, so globally, the statistic is that only 8% of companies have advisory boards. And the reason is essentially because it's not so easy to do. You can do it. You can do it right now. You can do it right now but it is an endeavor. So we thought, okay, we're going to go through quickly 5 best practices of building advisory boards. And of the 10 that we think there are. And so we want to kind of talk through this. Okay, so another poll. Have you ever built a house?
This one is also a little split, so I'll let it play out for a minute and see.
Okay, all right. So while the results are coming in, Chris, have you ever built a house?
I have built a house.
Would you do it again?
No, absolutely not.
Oh my gosh.
Kathy, have you?
Oh my gosh. Well, I built the house that I'm sitting in, or we built the house we're sitting in, and it was, yeah, I would not do it again. Because there's, building an advisory board, we think is kind of like building a house. So the first best practice that kind of you can sort of compare to building a house is that, let's see, you have to, if you're going to go build a house, you have to have clarity of scope. You know, you need to have well, if you're going to build a house, you need a blueprint. You need to know what part of the house is going to be used for what, and where the kitchen's going to be located, and where, you know, which kids have to share a bedroom and which kids don't. I mean, you have to be very specific. Similarly, in building an advisory board, you have to have clarity, like, what is the purpose? Are you trying to use the advisory board because, you know, you need access to funding? Are you trying to build the advisory board because you need access to people, or you have some strategic partnerships you're looking for? What is the reason? So sit down and build yourself a blueprint. All right. Second.
So Kathy, if I can pile on there.
Yeah.
By building a scope, one really accomplishes two things. The first thing it does is it forces the CEO to think through and write down, I need people, you have to describe each person in a paragraph. What did that person do in their career? What do they bring? Thing number one. Thing number two is when you go out to talk to candidates, when you show them the scope, they say, wow, these people have really thought about this. So they sit up a little straighter, and then they know you're serious. And so you get great people.
So, second one, Chris, when you built your house, did you have a contract?
I did.
I mean, of course. So in the kind of contract or document, what are some of the things that an advisory board would want to put into that contract?
It would specify what your expectations are of that person, how much time is involved, how they get paid. Usually they get paid in stock in the company, not in cash. And then what is not expected of them. But it really comes down to time.
Right. And how much time do you think someone would need to spend on average as an advisor?
It's really not a heavy lift as an advisor. It's like 1, maximum 2 hours a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then every quarter, a 2-hour group meeting with the other advisors.
Mm-hmm. All right. All right. You need a really good general contractor if you're going to, you know, build a house. That you need someone who's going to be masterminding, assembling, you know, all the pieces, in this case, creating the board. This could be a delegated resource, but you kind of need a person who's going to sort of keep the whole thing running for you. Yep. And similarly, Chris, we've talked about how diverse the board has to be.
The more diverse, the better. And I will also say one thing, Kathy.
Yeah.
And that's that I would urge people to shoot high.
Yeah.
Because you'd be amazed the people you can get on your advisory board. And just because they're well-known or celebrities or interviewed on TV doesn't mean you can't get them. You can do your homework. We have an internet. You can find their email address, and they get a lot fewer emails than you think. They get a lot fewer offers than you think. Mm-hmm. So shoot high. I built an advisory board when I was in private equity for a data analytics business. We recruited a guy named Phil Mui. He built Google Analytics. He had a master's from Harvard and a master's from MIT. Wow. Okay, the guy was incredible. And I tracked him down on his cell phone. He was in the Orlando airport. He had just landed. He was going to Disney World with his kids. And I just pitched him, and he said, "Yeah, I'd love to do this." Incredible.
I mean, yeah, it's amazing. You would think that these people in this stratosphere, they get continuously, you know, bombarded, but actually they are usually one of the reasons they have achieved so much is because that they're the type of person who sort of gives of their time.
They're super nice, humble people.
Yeah, it's incredible. Last best practice. if you're going to build a house, you have to keep up the maintenance. And so this is actually something that a very important best practice for advisory boards. You have to have a minimum schedule of engagement. At minimum, you have to be talking to everybody monthly. You have to get them engaged. You have to share information. You have to say, okay, we're having a problem in this part of the business, and you have to be very open with them. And what we've learned is that when your advisors start using the plural, when they start saying, well, you know what we ought to do, that's when you know you've got them hooked, because they really do want to, they've got themselves invested emotionally in the business.
That's so true. Yeah.
All right, so last, well, I got one more quick slide, but kind of as we wrap up the presentation part, these are actually questions that you can ask yourself, right? And we would suggest that if you can answer at least, you can check mark about 2 of these, you are probably ready for an advisory board. Getting one right out of the gate, like when you just, are, two people sitting in an apartment, is actually fairly unusual. But if you feel like you've kind of got a sense of what the business model is, there are experts you want to talk to, you've got demand traction on the business, and you're starting to think about the business is at an inflection point, that's when you want to, that's the best time to call it in an advisory board. That's when the ROI of the advisory board is really going to hit. So just one more thing. Oh, okay, good. Oh, there are experts you'd like to talk to if you could. Oh my gosh, that's a perfect one. So we have one of the things when we talk to people about building advisory boards. One time somebody said to us, well, I don't really know. He was like, I don't really know if it's worth it. And I said to him, well, who would you pay money to talk to? And he said, Mark Cuban. I would pay money to talk to Mark Cuban. I'm like, okay, well then it all depends on who you have on the board, right? Whether you think it's worth it or not. There are 5 other best practices. You can go to our website, theabplatform.com, download the white paper. It has the other 10, and that'll kind of give you the kind of blueprint to walk you through how you create an advisory board and what you need to do. That is it for us from a presentation point. Wow, hello everybody. It's so cool. Now that I put it on gallery view, I saw everybody. Questions from the group?
Yeah, well, let's do some Q&A. So I know the first one, some people were wondering if we would mind sharing the slides after the meeting. So
Oh, yeah.
Kathy, if you're okay with that, yeah, we can share them out with our team, and everyone will also get the meeting recording to us, so you'll see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, first couple questions is, when you say over 90% of businesses do not have an advisory board, are we talking about small to mid-size private companies? Can you define this a little better, since public companies do have boards? Thank you.
Yeah, so big public companies and actually fairly often small companies do have fiduciary boards. So that's not the type of board we're talking about. Those are boards that have kind of oversight, legal accountability. They're decision makers. When we're talking about advisory boards, we're talking about this other kind of board that is sort of, they are designated. They have a very specific role. You have a contract with them, but they're not fiduciary in that standpoint. So 92% of companies, that's actually the specific number, do not have advisory boards. And that's across all, I should say, all sizes of businesses.
Going back to the building the house comments, someone said, maybe the contrarian question is, what benefits do you occur when building a house?
Okay, Chris, you want to take that? I have an idea, but you want to take it?
No, if you have an idea, go ahead.
Okay, so here's what people say is the reason for building a house. They say if you build a house, you get exactly what you want. You get, if you want, we wanted 4 bedrooms upstairs and we wanted 2 Jack and Jills and we wanted our bedroom in a certain place and we wanted, you know, we wanted certain types of windows. You get exactly what you want. Now, you can just buy a house and remodel, which frankly, I would probably do, but you're still going to have to go through the blueprinting process and figure out what you want to do. But that's a good question. You get what you want. And that's the point of advisory boards. We find that the request for the advisors that people are looking for are like, Chris, you described them as niches of niches. You know, because you've got, you know, an advisory board who does pharmacy accounts payable, and they want to know, or sorry, pharmacy software, and they want to talk to specific people with experience in that business at a certain point in time who worked at a certain company. So it's the specificity, that's the value.
Yep.
Okay, great. Next question says, a couple of people I wanted as advisors, but it took too much to negotiate advisory shares or equity. When you build a house, the architect and contractor don't take equity. It's a cleaner agreement and easier to negotiate. Do you think contracts with advisors are based on time and value or have an equity component?
Well, the formula I have found that works, that always worked for me when I was building businesses, is I would give advisors stock in the business, because then I didn't have a P&L hit every year on cash. What I would do, what I found was that the market value was like 0.2% of your outstanding stock. And so what I would do is I would take 1% of the company's stock, divide in 5. And that was always the formula. And then I would just give them an instrument that the board had already approved. If I had a fiduciary board, they would have already approved something for employees. So I would just use the same instrument versus coming up with something new and different. That worked. And my promise to the advisors was sign up for 5 years. Our goal is that your stock is worth $100,000 in 5 years. So you're getting about $20,000 a year in deferred comp, but it's not a heavy lift. Okay. Now, nobody has a magic crystal ball. So sometimes you're high, sometimes you're low. And the advisors know that. One of the things I found was that generally the advisors were not doing this for comp. They were doing this to give back. They were doing this because they wanted to be part of something new and exciting. They were doing this to network with the other advisors. If you have venture or private equity investors, they were doing this to learn about venture private equity and how that works. So the stock was like 3rd on the list for the advisors.
Did your advisors walk away with money at the end?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Because
I mean, I had in private equity, I had one example where the advisors, instead of getting 100,000, they got 5 times that because the outcome was so good. Now, that's highly unusual. But then the advisor, who was my friend, he called me and he said, do you have any other advisory boards?
Well, because you had developed this whole system of how to connect with them, right? I mean,
Totally.
probably we think about 30% of the value is in creating the board. 70% of the value is in the engagement that follows. It's in the ability for the CEO to call up one of the advisors on Friday at 4 o'clock and go, you would not believe what just happened to me. Do you know anybody who does such and such? And that's when it really starts to pay off, when you've got that relationship.
Okay, great. Our next question, kind of going along with that, says, how do you determine the amount of stock compensation for advisory board members, and should all receive the same comp?
So back to the last question, Skylar. We would take 1% divided in 5. Everybody would get the same amount. And what I would tell the advisors is, this is the package. So I wouldn't go into a big negotiation with the advisors, because at that point, they were sold on the company, the CEO, the mission and vision of what we're trying to do. And they were just like, yeah, we know you're going to be fair with us. they would just sign. We would never negotiate with the advisors.
And if they don't want, if they say that's not what I want, you just say, okay, you go find somebody else, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they start negotiating with you, they're probably not the right person.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Next question that we have says, what if I have an advisory board, but they aren't really the right people? How do I change that?
Great question.
We do run into that one.
What I found is that kind of quickly. It's like hiring a new person. You know in 30 to 60 days what you have. And same with an advisor. Once you've gotten like 2 monthly cycles or 1 quarter and 2 quarterly advisory team meetings, you kind of know if they're into it or not. And if they're not into it, then what I would do is the same thing as an employee who's not working out. Like, you have to have a conversation and you say, I either need you to be into this and help me, or I need somebody else.
Mhm,
And maybe something's going on in their life and they really can't do it or don't have time.
mhm.
But I think you have to be intentional, proactive, just like you would as an employer.
And just to kind of pile on that, if you have a couple people, I mean, maybe you started with an advisory board way back when, and it sort of has outlived its usefulness. We often suggest that that you relaunch your board. So we have some customers who they might have, a couple of people and one of them is really leaning in and the rest aren't. So we say, okay, well, let's relaunch the thing and sort of start fresh.
Okay, great. And someone along these lines had asked me if you would be able to share an advisory board member agreement or template, something to go off of.
Sure, what?
The advisory board member agreement that we use.
Yeah, we actually use a standard agreement. It's called I think it's a standard legal agreement. We can share that.
Yeah, it's not.
Okay, great. Do you see advisory boards today considering reputation experts, Marcom executives serving as advisors beyond the traditional legal and accounting codes?
100%, like 1,000,000%. We actually have, for our board, we have 10 advisors, and we intentionally chose each one because we wanted specific capabilities. We wanted someone who had, wanted an HR person who had deep experience in that area, who knew about recruiting. We wanted somebody who really knew how to do B2B marketing. We wanted somebody who was actually was really good in kind of diversity and creating connections. We wanted someone who knew AI and could help us figure that out. So at 100%, I mean, whereas a fiduciary board, if you were a CEO or a CFO, COO, that you might be, that's generally who populates those sorts of boards.
Okay, great. Let's see. The next question is, it starts out with saying, we specialize in finding international board members to assist in penetrating new national markets. Do you like the idea of advisory board members offering counsel on the cultural and market understanding of other nations?
I think it depends on what your business model is. So if you go back to the report from the Startup Genome, if you get back on their website, they have a number of other factors that correlate to success. And one of them is if you have a person involved in the business who is connected to whatever the local area is in which you're trying to compete, that is another correlated factor of success. So yeah, if you want to penetrate other markets, 100%. Okay,
great. Next question is, what is the single biggest thing you've learned about advisory boards?
I don't know if Chris, did you go away? Well, I think that he appears to have maybe lost his connection or something. Yeah, so I think it's I think it's a couple things. Number one, that 30-70 rule that I talked about, where companies, that 30% of the value is building the board, but 70% is keeping it running. And that, and again, engaging with people on a regular basis. For me, that was the biggest one. It's interesting. The other thing we learned was that, you know, CEOs are so busy, and people who startup entrepreneurs are so busy. No one is typing into their browser, how do I form an advisory board? Because they just aren't. It's not, and if you think about it in terms of investments, it's one of the highest ROI investments you can make, but people aren't doing that because it sort of sits in the back of, you know, in the back. It's not a house on fire. And yet, like, the results are dramatic if you put one in place and run it correctly.
Okay, great. Do you have any recommendations on how to structure the advisory board compensation when your business has a blend of restrictive federal certifications, for example, SBA 8A and commercial product development?
That one is way outside my pay grade. I don't, but we do have some experts on advisory boards that we can follow up with, you know, connect you over to, because they do take different forms, and, you know, different businesses are structured different ways. But I don't want to answer that one directly myself, but if we could follow up, that would be great. That was Tasha who said that, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Oh, hey, Tasha.
Perfect. Okay, next question is, how much of my time would this take?
As the CEO, we have a definitive estimate of that. It will take you roughly 200 hours to set up and run your advisory board over the first 90 to 120 days. And that is another reason why CEOs don't often do that, because they're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of time. It's lots and lots of administrative time, for one thing. It's sourcing the people, it's talking to them, it's managing your schedule so that you can talk at the same time. It's all that. And so that's it's interesting when we talk to CEOs who are considering this, when we say, I'm not necessarily pitching our business, but when we tell them we will take that all off your plate for you, it's like you can almost see the weight come off of their shoulders. Like they're like, okay, that's awesome, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the background. That goes back to why only 8% of companies have advisory boards. It is work.
There is an element of herding cats in this.
Yes. Yep. And we have some expert cat herders.
Okay, perfect. I think that that's the end of our questions. I don't know, we're almost out of time anyway. If
Okay.
there's anyone who wanted to unmute and ask themselves, we can do that. Otherwise, we can end the meeting here. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to stay on later. We'll keep this open for a few minutes for anyone to hang around. But we're super glad that everyone could join us today. And like I said, I will be circulating that meeting recording and the deck so that everyone can take a look at those afterwards. But thank you so much, Kathy and Chris.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tien and Scott, for having us.
Absolutely. We appreciate it.